All right, this is week 6 in a course on world religions, an elective of the theology program. I'm Rob Bowman, your instructor, and today we are looking at Hinduism. This is part 2 on Hinduism. Last week I gave you something of a fast overview of the history of Hinduism, which goes back pretty close to 4,000 years. We looked at the development of Hinduism from a very early age of obvious polytheism to a much more mixed situation today, where there are very philosophical pantheistic forms of Hinduism. There is still a great deal of polytheistic belief and even idolatry in Hinduism as it is practiced in India and elsewhere, but especially in India. And we looked at some of the basic ideas in Hinduism regarding God, reincarnation, yoga, the different paths that Hindus can follow, and the fact that there are many such paths and no one path is the only path for everyone. And we talked a little bit about how from within this perspective, Hindus very often will perceive the message about Christianity to be a message about one more instance in which the divine was manifested or revealed or took physical form in what Hindus popularly call avatars, and that they may view Jesus as one of many avatars or one of many physical manifestations of the deity, and in particular of the deity Vishnu, which is the deity in Hinduism that is capable of taking human form. Now, this week we're going to look at how we as Christians can respond to Hinduism, and I thought we'd do something a little different with this, and what we're going to do is we're going to do a little Bible study. And we're going to look at a particular passage in the New Testament, and we're going to relate it throughout to Hinduism, even though the passage isn't talking about Hinduism per se. As I will hopefully convince you, this passage presents a good model for sharing the gospel with people of a Hindu religious background. Now, the passage is one that I'm sure is known to most of you, if not all of you, and but I would like you to follow along in this passage, and perhaps somebody who's in the class at the moment here is able to do some cutting and pasting of biblical text. You might help us out here by even pasting the text as we go along. The passage that we're going to look at is Acts chapter 17, verses 16 through 31. Acts chapter 17, verses 16 through 31. Now, this is the famous passage about the evangelistic outreach of the Apostle Paul in the city of Athens. And, of course, the centerpiece of this passage is the account of Paul's speech at the Areopagus to the Athenian philosophers, the Stoics and Epicureans there, where he explains the Christian message in terms that, at least potentially, they may be able to understand. So we're going to look at this passage as a model for talking about religious things, talking about spiritual things, and talking about Christ with people of a Hindu background. All right, now let me begin by reading verse 16. Again, this is Acts, the book of Acts, chapter 17, and let me just read verse 16. Now, while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was being provoked within him, as he was beholding the city full of idols. Paul was in Athens. Athens was the intellectual center of the Greco-Roman world, of the Mediterranean world. Athens was kind of like Boston was to the United States as the intellectual and, in some ways, philosophical center. Boston was, let's say, in the 18th and much of the 19th centuries. And some people would try to argue that it still is today, with Harvard and so forth there. Well, Athens was a university town of sorts, you could call it. It would be analogous to that. They didn't have universities then, but it was a kind of intellectual center. Athens was the city that produced Socrates and Aristotle, and it was the center of intellectual debate and philosophical argument concerning the different schools of Greek philosophy that emerged in the time just prior to Paul coming to Athens. In the previous couple of centuries, you have the emergence of very sophisticated philosophical systems, Platonism, Stoicism, Epicureanism, and Aristotelianism as well. Now, the Stoics and Epicureans apparently were especially interested in what Paul had to say, and they had gotten into it in a pretty serious way. So what's going on here is that Paul is in a city where every religion that the people there know about is given some kind of credence. There are lots and lots of altars or shrines to various deities. There are altars to all kinds of gods, and these altars are adorned in various ways, and they have idols. The idols are statues, generally speaking, of various deities portrayed, generally speaking, as anthropomorphic figures, human-like figures. And of course, most of us are very familiar with the traditions of the ancient Greeks and Romans and their various gods and goddesses, one of which was actually called Athena, okay? And of course Zeus, and we can think of all the different Roman and Greek names, or Latin and Greek names for these deities that were worshipped in Athens and throughout the Mediterranean world at the time of Jesus and Paul. And Paul, Luke notes that Paul was very disturbed by his observation that the city was full of idols. It was so thick with idols that it was like a forest of idols, is the way some commentators have interpreted the language that Luke uses here. Idols everywhere you went. It was a very religious city. And Paul did not look upon this extreme religiosity of the Athenians as entirely a good thing. His spirit was provoked within him. He was disturbed by the ignorance of the true God, because they were worshiping every god except the right one, the one that actually existed and created the world and was deserving of their worship and their honor. And so Paul, and he wasn't even planning on preaching in Athens or trying to start a church there, but he's waiting for some friends, he's waiting for some co-workers there, and he finds himself with an opportunity. And your encounter with a Hindu may come in a similar way. You may be someplace with no intention of evangelizing or sharing the gospel, but you find yourself talking to somebody that's obviously from India, perhaps has certain indications in the way that they are dressed or their facial appearance and so forth that you could tell that they're Hindu in religion, and you may be aware of that, and you may have opportunities to talk about the gospel with people sometimes when you're not even planning on doing it. That's what happened with Paul. He found himself engaging people in conversation in Athens while he was actually waiting for some other people. Now, Hinduism is also full of idols. There are numerous religions represented in what we call Hinduism. We talked about this last time, that Hinduism isn't even really one religion. It's a multitude of religions with a multitude of deities. Hindus will often tell you that they believe that there are 330 million gods. That's 330 million gods. But in another sense, Hindus will often tell you that, of course, there's only one. It all depends on which Hindu you talk to and how they interpret these things. So there is a kind of religious pluralism in Athens, and there's a religious pluralism in Hinduism, because Hindus are quite comfortable with a mixing and matching of religious ideas, even if they're not completely consistent with one another. They're quite happy to honor various deities with various names, gods and goddesses, that are pictured and portrayed and interpreted in various different ways. And it's all good, because there are various ways of experiencing the divine, various ways of moving forward in one's spiritual journey, and whatever God and whatever yoga or path that helps you to that God is fine. Well, Paul then finds himself engaging in conversation with people, and some of these people do believe in the same God that he believes in, basically, some of them, because they're Jews or God-fearing Gentiles who accepted the God of Israel but had not become Jewish in terms of their own religious commitment. And so we see in verse 17 that Paul was reasoning in the synagogue with the Jews and the God-fearing Gentiles, and in the marketplace every day with those who happened to be present. And also some of the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers were conversing with him. And some were saying, "What would this idle babbler wish to say?" Others, "He seems to be a proclaimer of strange deities, because he was preaching Jesus and the resurrection." And they took him and brought him to the Areopagus, saying, "May we know what this new teaching is that you are proclaiming? For you are bringing some strange things to our ears. We want to know, therefore, what these things mean." Now all the Athenians and the strangers visiting there used to spend their time in nothing other than telling or hearing something new. That's Acts chapter 17, verses 17 through 21. Brings us right up to the edge of the passage before the beginning of Paul's speech. Now, what we see here is that in Athens, Paul encountered a variety of individuals from various religious backgrounds. There were, of course, Jews and God-fearing Gentiles. And he talked with them. He'd go preach in the synagogue, but then he'd go out of the synagogue, and he would talk in the marketplace. And typically when he was in the marketplace, the agora, he would be talking with Gentiles, with Athenians who did not believe in the God of Israel and may not even have been very much aware of the God of Israel. They may have heard of Jews, but they didn't really understand what Jews believed. That would be a very typical situation. So Paul is talking with these people in the marketplace, and he's discovering that there is a variety of beliefs, even among the pagans in Athens. And really we could talk about three different kinds of people that he met. The first group of people would be the traditionalists. These would be people who actually worshipped a variety of deities through the religious veneration of idols, and they might even have idols in their own homes. They would go to various temples or shrines in Athens, and they would worship the gods at those locations, burn incense to them or whatever it was that they did. And these traditionalists would have understood the gods in a very literal fashion. They would have accepted the Homeric myths about the gods on Mount Olympus as literal anthropomorphic deities that had their own different things that they did, that controlled various parts of the world. There was a god of the sea and a god of the thunder and a god of the corn and, on and on and on. And so they would have accepted this polytheistic worldview without, really any question. In many cases, these traditionalists could say, we've been believing the same thing as our fathers before us for hundreds and even thousands of years. And they would have been right, because it was a traditional Hellenistic belief, a traditional Greek belief in the gods that went back centuries. So that's the first group of people that Paul would have met. The second group of people that Paul would have met were the Stoics. The Stoics were Greeks who believed that religion, the traditional religion that we've just talked about, with all the many gods and the idol worship, that these were pointers to a more profound, philosophically tenable spiritual reality, a unity of spiritual truth or spiritual existence, spiritual reality, divinity that was underneath everything, that permeated everything. Some of them would have called this the Logos. And they would have had different terms for it. But the idea was that there was some kind of pervasive, transcendent, spiritual, rational, intelligible force or power of the cosmos that kept everything coherent, that kept everything going, that made the sun to shine and the rain to fall and the crops to grow, that kept the seasons going in their annual cycle, and so on and so forth. And that there was that the popular religion wasn't literally true, but it was spiritually useful because it pointed to this divine reality that undergirded everything, even if it did so in a kind of crass, primitive way. This folk religion was still onto something. And it was important to preserve it because this was a useful mythological way of expressing this profound spiritual truth, which the Stoics said, the rank and file, the common man, doesn't have the mind for philosophy, but he can understand the burning of incense to a deity, and that helps him to connect with this higher reality. And so the Stoics reinterpreted popular Greek religion as a mythological way of looking at this profound divinity that they saw in all things. The third group of pagans that Paul encountered in Athens were represented by the Epicureans, and the Epicureans basically was this group of people. The Epicureans were much more critical of popular Athenian religion, much more critical of popular Hellenistic or Greek religion. They said, there are no gods. There's just matter. There's just atoms. There's just stuff bouncing around, and we are all some kind of, cosmic fluke or cosmic accident. And, we're not going to try to stop people from worshiping the gods because it helps them keep in line and be moral. But really, people need to understand that this is a superstitious way of thinking about things. that the gods can't help you. They do not answer your prayers. And the Stoics put a nice philosophical spin on it, but it's just they're just doing damage control and trying to find some way of affirming the validity of popular religion, even though they also know it's not true. And so the Epicureans were kind of the skeptics. In fact, there was a school of thought called skepticism, but here the Epicureans represent a kind of a moderate and more popular form of skepticism. It was a specifically religious skepticism that said, this whole business about the gods is just so yesterday. We really know more about the cosmos now, and we know that's just not the way it is. Now, you could draw all kinds of parallels. We find these three kinds of people in American society today all over the place. But I want to draw a comparison here with Hindus. There are Hindus who are traditionalist Hindus. They believe in the gods. There are many gods. There's 330 million gods. There are all kinds of ways of worshiping the divine. All of these are good. We may have our own particular deity that we like, that we worship. We're not saying anything bad about people that worship other gods. We think there are many gods. That is a popular form of Hinduism. You find that more commonly in India than you do among Indian immigrants to the United States, for example. I'm not saying you won't find it at all here, but it won't be as common. But there's a lot of it still in India. So you do have your traditionalists. Then you've got your philosophical Hindus who say Hindu religion expresses mythologically the truth that there is divinity in all things, that the divine takes many forms in our experience, but in fact there's really only one divine reality. In fact, there is really only one reality, many of these Hindus say, that there is only Brahman, there is only the divine, or God, if you will, and everything else is either a manifestation of Brahman or it's an illusion. So you've got your philosophical Hindus who reinterpret polytheistic Hinduism in this pantheistic, esoteric, mystical kind of fashion. And then you've got your secular Hindus. And there are a lot of them in the United States, by the way. These are people from India who've come to North America or who've traveled to the United Kingdom, for example. You'll find quite a few in the United Kingdom as well. And they're from India, or they might be from a neighboring country like Pakistan. And they are of Hindu religious background. They grew up in a Hindu cultural religious context. They know about the gods. They know about the philosophical interpretation of Brahman, which they think is more respectable, but in the end, they themselves are secularists. The gods don't exist. They're not dissing the gods. They're not putting that down. They don't particularly themselves worship the gods, but they respect the gods as part of their own cultural background, the beliefs of their parents or their grandparents back home in India, but they are themselves secular. And so when you meet somebody from India who has moved to your part of the world, let's say somewhere in North America or the United Kingdom or someplace like that, you will find that many of them are secular. You will find that many of them, perhaps not quite as many, but some of them, a good number of them, embrace this philosophical pantheistic interpretation of Hinduism, and you might occasionally run into somebody who is more traditionalist, but that would be unusual probably. So we see a very similar situation that Paul engages when he's in Athens, as what we would be engaging when we are talking with somebody of a Hindu background. Now, at this point, we can look at Paul's speech, and I want to look at verse 22, which is the beginning of Paul's speech. Paul says in Acts 17, verse 22, and Paul stood at, Luke introduces this by saying, and Paul stood in the midst of the Areopagus and said, quote, and here begins the speech, Men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. Now, there's an interesting linguistic phenomenon going on here. Depending on what translation you look at, you will see some translations render this key word here very religious, and others will render it superstitious. And the reason why there is this difference is because the word can be taken either way. It's one of those words that could be used in a complimentary way, could be used in a critical way. It would all depend on context, and it's a little hard to tell. So what Paul does here is he picks a word that's a pretty clever use of this particular word, because from their perspective, they could easily take this as, I see that you're very religious. I see that you're very spiritually minded, as a compliment. But it has a bit of an edge to it, because it can easily be taken. I see that you are a superstitious group of people. And probably the Epicureans would have taken it that way. The Epicureans would have said, yeah, I'm afraid a lot of us are superstitious. So it has that double-edged connotation to it. But what Paul is doing here is he is acknowledging the religiosity of the Athenians, but he's not endorsing it. In fact, he's at least leaving himself open to, free to go on and critique it. And this is, in fact, what he is going to end up doing, though he's going to do it in a very polite way, and it will not be until close to the end of the speech before the Athenians realize that Paul has been dismantling their whole belief system. Now, for much of the speech, I have to tell you that if you were an Athenian in the 50s AD, when Paul comes to Athens and is presenting this speech, for much of the speech, you would not know, probably, that Paul was disagreeing with the Stoics. Most of what he says probably would have been heard, at least, by the Stoics as something they could agree with. Now, Paul is going in a different direction, and eventually the Stoics catch up with him and realize that Paul's not agreeing with them either. But it could certainly be understood that way for a good bit. In fact, verses 24 to 29 could easily be taken that way. But before we look at that, let me look at what Paul says in verse 23. He says, For while I was passing through and examining the objects of your worship, I also found an altar with this inscription, To an unknown God. What therefore you worship in ignorance, this I proclaim to you. Now I think that there are probably some people in some missiology professors and some theologians among us in evangelical Christianity, that if somebody used a strategy like this in evangelizing Hindus, they might be very unhappy about it. Because what Paul is doing here is arguably a bit risky. You see, in Athens, they had altars to all kinds of deities. But because there were so many of them, and because they had visitors from all over the Roman Empire who came to their city, who worshipped other gods that the Athenians didn't know, the Athenians apparently covered themselves, as it were, hedged their bets by having altars to unknown gods, as well as altars to gods with specific names. And so there would be these altars to unknown deities. And Paul apparently found one of these. And he picks on this and he says, that's actually why I'm here. I'm actually here to tell you about this God that you don't know. And that's a kind of a risky approach, you could argue, because it might be misinterpreted, let's put it that way, as acknowledging the legitimacy of Athenian polytheism and Athenian idolatry and all of their different shrines and altars. And Paul might be misinterpreted as saying, you've got all these gods that you worship, I've brought you one more. And clearly that's not what Paul is going to do, but you could see how somebody might initially take it that way. But what Paul is doing is he's warming up his audience, and he's not saying anything false. He is there to proclaim an unknown God to them, a God they don't know. But he's warming them up and preparing them for the heavy message, for the shock that is going to come, because it is going to be a shock. They are going to be very surprised by what Paul says. But he starts with something that is not particularly shocking. You acknowledge that there are deities you don't know. I'm here to tell you about the God you don't know. And so then Paul launches into his case. And I think that this shows us that when sharing the gospel with people of other religions, that we should try to find some points of connection, even if they might be, in a sense, far-fetched, or if they might be a bit of a stretch. Some kind of analogy, some kind of illustration, some kind of point of contact in their religious, philosophical, cultural perspective that will help them kind of get a handle on what we're saying. I mean, it would be almost as if Paul had said, gone to some Hindus and said, you believe that there are 10 avatars of Vishnu, and that only 9 of them have taken place. So you're looking for a final avatar or incarnation of Vishnu. Well, I'm here to tell you about the definitive incarnation of God. I'm here to tell you about when God really did become incarnate. And so you could imagine somebody trying to help a Hindu kind of ease into the Christian message by comparing the doctrine of the incarnation to an avatar. Now, it's not the same thing, and you'd have to eventually make it clear that it isn't the same thing. But Hindus themselves, who have heard of Jesus, make that connection. And so what you can say is something like, that's getting close to what it is that I'm saying. It's not 100% there, but it's a place to start, and then let me try to explain what it is that we actually believe. And you'll find Christian apologists and Christian missiologists who take different positions on just how to go about doing this sort of thing. Where the controversy really is hot and heavy today is with Islam, of course. What can you do this sort of thing with Islam, and where is it appropriate? But with Hinduism, you don't see this being talked about nearly as much because the Hindu presence in the United States is not as noticeable. There are a lot of Hindus here, just that most of them, are quiet compared to the Islamic community in the United States. Well, so Paul goes on then, after these introductory remarks in verses 22 and 23, to talk to them about God. And the core of his argument then begins with verse 24. So let me read that. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. Now, that's Acts 17, verse 24. Now, this is kind of interesting because what Paul does here is he begins with God as creator. the Stoics certainly were comfortable with the idea of God as the maker of the world. They wouldn't necessarily have articulated it exactly the way Paul does, but they wouldn't have had a big problem with it either. Most cultures have some kind of concept of creation. They don't have it exactly right. They don't have it biblically, theologically correct. But most cultures have some kind of belief in a creator deity. And that is also true of Hinduism. And we talked about this last week, that Hinduism has a triumvirate or triad of deities, one of which is called Brahma, and Brahma is the creator God. And you could make the analogy here that Paul is beginning by saying the God that I am here to talk about is the true God that you worship, or some of you worship, not really fully understanding him, but that some of you worship under the name Brahma. Now notice how I've just put it there. We're not saying that Brahma is the true God. What we're saying is, when you worship Brahma as the creator God, you are acknowledging the existence of a creator, even though you don't really know him. And in fact, most forms of Hinduism acknowledge that Brahma is not really knowable. You can't really cuddle up to Brahma. You can't really have an intimate relationship with Brahma. You can't really know Brahma. You can acknowledge his existence, perhaps even worship him in some fashion. But generally speaking, when Hindus pursue a spiritual relationship with a deity, it's not Brahma. But Paul then is saying, look, I'm here to tell you about the true creator God, and you know there is one, but I'm here to tell you about him, because I know him, and I know some things about him you need to know. Now, one thing that's very interesting that he says here is that this God who made everything is the Lord of heaven and earth. And as the Lord of heaven and earth, Paul says, he doesn't live in temples made by human beings. He doesn't live in man-made temples made by human hands. Now, this is a concept that is of importance in the book of Acts with regard to Judaism as well, because the Jewish temple is under divine judgment pronounced by Jesus himself just a few days before his crucifixion, and repeated in the book of Acts by Stephen in Acts chapter 7. But now Paul here brings this point up again, but in a context of pagan religion, because the pagans in Athens had all kinds of temples and shrines and altars, and some of these temples were pretty impressive forms of architecture. And you can imagine somebody going to Athens who'd never been there and never seen anything like it and being very impressed. But Paul makes the point that the God who made everything certainly cannot be encapsulated in a man-made temple, because the God who made everything clearly transcends everything. And so Paul here is helping the Athenians to acknowledge something that their best philosophers have at least gotten a partial handle on, which is these temples really aren't places where the deity dwells. That's a mythological way of thinking about the deity. Paul is affirming the correctness of that philosophical insight, and he's using it to press home a point that will become clear as he proceeds. Since this God does not dwell in human temples made by human hands, this is a transcendent God who doesn't need anything. And Paul says in verse 25, neither is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all life and breath and all things. Now here, if we think about this in the context of Hinduism, one could say that it is if at this point that Paul says, not only is the true God that I am here to proclaim to you the God you dimly recognize in Brahma. But he's also the God that you dimly recognize in Vishnu, the preserver God. Because Vishnu in Hinduism is the preserver deity, the deity who preserves life, who sustains the world in its order, and who sustains all living things. Well, Paul is saying, my God, the God I'm here to tell you about, is not only the God that you try to represent with Brahma as the creator God, but he's also the preserver God. So he's acknowledging that they are aware in some dim fashion of the true God, but they don't really understand because they've separated the true God into these various deities. And the philosophers haven't done much better in Athens, and neither do they in Hinduism, because they substitute for these many deities one impersonal abstraction or impersonal cosmic force. And Paul does not speak about God that way. His God is the Lord of heaven and earth. He's a personal deity who created the world and everything in it, and personally cares for his creation, providing life and breath and all things. And so you have a personal concept of God as well as a oneness concept of God, that God is one and personal. You see, the Hindus as well as the Greeks had trouble putting both of these together. If you're a polytheist, you've got many gods, but they're personal. They're personal beings. If you're a pantheist, you've got one God, but he's not quite personal. In fact, he's usually understood in a very impersonal fashion. Paul preaches to the Athenians a God who is one and who is personal at the same time. That is a conception that non-biblical religions have had trouble attaining. They usually fall into either polytheism or pantheism, or try to find some way of mixing the two. Christianity, like Judaism, falls into neither of these errors. The Jewish and Christian conception of God is theistic, monotheistic, one personal creator, sustainer God. So Paul here is making his case, and I think that we can see a model here for presenting the one God of Christianity in terms that Hindus can understand, while at the same time, and connect it with the Hindu conceptions, at the same time not endorsing the Hindu understanding of the deities. Then in verse 27, Paul continues by saying that this God made from one every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation. Now, this is a very interesting point that he makes here that we can take to the Hindu to make a very interesting point. In classic philosophical Hinduism, we are all part of Brahman. We are all part of the divine that is in all things. In the more popular traditionalist forms of Hinduism, we are incorporeal spirits hopping from one body to the next. But we don't really belong to any of those physical forms. This isn't really me. What you're seeing is just my this particular temporary housing in which I live. And I'm going to have a change of address when I die and move to another house, another physical structure. Well, and that's the classic, that's the ancient traditional polytheistic understanding, but the classical Hindu philosophy has a similar understanding, even though it's more philosophical, and that is that your your spirit, which is part of the cosmic spirit of the divine all, the Brahman, your sort of spark or piece of Brahman gets reincarnated over and over in different bodies. But those bodies are not you. That body that you have is not really you. It's not even really part of you. It's just the house that you are currently living in. And again, you will be having a change of address at some point. Now, against this particular view, Christianity comes to the Hindu and says, actually, that is you, and this is me. And our sense of identity, that I am this physical being that you see before you, is not an illusion, as Hinduism maintains, but it is reality. God actually made us to live in this physical world. That's what Paul is saying in verse 27. Our physical existence is not a mistake. It is not a temporary situation. We are not trapped. We are not divine spirits trapped in physical forms and needing to escape from them via the wheel of reincarnation to cycle through it until we finally achieve moksha, until we are finally liberated from the physical world and re-merge with the divine. That is not the goal of life. You are valuable. You mean something. You are unique and you are important. And so am I, because God made us as physical beings. I believe that if we present this right to Hindus, they can see this as a very positive, life-affirming, encouraging, even exciting message. Contrasting with the Hindu doctrine that you're really not what you think you are. And what your whole identity that you experience is an illusion. So this is a key point. And, people can talk themselves into believing false doctrines and believing things like, I am really an illusion, my sense of identity as Rob Bowman is an illusion. But it's not true, and part of us always knows that it's not true. Something in us is aware of the fact that this is not a fully satisfying explanation of reality. And so a little splash of cold water in the face philosophically by hearing the message, you know what? You are somebody, and you are who you think you are. You are a person of enduring, abiding importance and identity. And your physicality is part of that. Your being a human being is essential to that. That's who you are. That's what God made you to be. But there is a clear contrast here between Hinduism and Christianity that we need to convey to the Hindu. Now, Paul goes on and he says in verse 28 what God's purpose in making these physical beings is. He's created us with a specific purpose in mind, and that is for a relationship with Him. And it's something that we all need to seek. And so he says in verse 27, that was verse 26 I just talked about, not 27. In verse 27, Paul says that they should seek God, if perhaps they might grope for Him and find Him, though He is not far from each one of us. Now, Paul here says something that's very interesting in relation to Hinduism. He talks about people seeking God, but they're seeking for Him like people groping for Him in the dark. The imagery of groping, of course, is the image of people who can't see what it is they're looking for, either because it's dark or because they're blind, but they're seeking for God, and they're groping for Him in the dark. He's right there. He's not far from us, but we're having trouble finding Him because we're groping for Him in the dark. Now, I'm sure we've all heard the famous Hindu parable of the blind men and the elephant. The blind men cannot see the elephant that's right in front of their faces. They are groping for some evidence, some clue, something that they can grab onto that will tell them what this is. So one blind man grabs a hold of something and says, "Aha, it is a rope." Well, he has grabbed the tail of the elephant. Another person grabs onto something and says, "Aha, it is a tree." It's actually the leg of the elephant, and so on. And the point of the parable is that, as it is commonly narrated and concluded, that God is kind of like that elephant. We all have our own descriptions of God. We all have our own ways of thinking about God. And some of us think that God is like this, and some of us think that God is like that. And we're all grasping onto part of the truth, but no one really knows what God is like, because we're all like those blind men that are groping in the dark of their own blindness, and therefore never attain a full knowledge of the elephant. And likewise, human beings have their different religions, they have their different philosophies, they have their different worldviews, and all of them have part of the truth, and none of them have all of the truth. Now, you've heard this before, probably. And I think that we can see that in Paul's speech here in verse 27, that he is saying something a little bit similar. He's saying, that's true. We're all kind of groping in the dark. People are looking for God, and they have their different opinions about God, and they have their different religions. And let's face it, there's a lot of people who are just guessing. They don't really know. They've grabbed onto something, but what they've grabbed onto is not the whole truth about God. So, I think some Christians, when they hear the story of the blind man and the elephant, they think, "Oh my goodness, that's relativism. You're saying that there is no absolute truth." Now, of course, there are people that use the parable to teach that there's no absolute truth. They're absolutely wrong about that. The parable presupposes that there is an absolute truth. It is an elephant. That's what it is. The blind men never attain that knowledge because they're blind. And so there is an absolute truth, but none of the blind men has an absolute knowledge of that truth. Relativism, which says there is no absolute truth, is false. Now, if someone says, "Well, there's absolute truth, but we can't get it. We can't know absolute truth," I would say, you know what? By ourselves, in our present condition, there's some truth to what you say. We are never able, in and of ourselves, to arrive at absolute truth. And if there is a God, and he doesn't do anything to help us, we could continue to grope in the dark, trying to figure out God and never get anywhere. Just like those blind men. Because none of the blind men in the parable says, it is an elephant. None of them get it. They all only get very small parts of the answer. So what's the real answer here? How could one ever possibly know that it is really God that we're talking about here? How could we ever really know God? How could the blind men ever really know that it's an elephant? Somebody would have to tell them. Somebody that could see. And the best thing to do would be if somebody could open their eyes, make them able to see, so they can actually see the elephant, and no longer be blind. But at the very least, they would need to have somebody tell them, you're only partly right. I know it feels like a rope to you, but that's actually a tail. And the thing that you're really touching is an elephant. That's what you need. You would need revelation. Somebody who could see the elephant and tell you what it is. Well, Paul is coming to the Athenians, and he's saying, you guys have all these deities. You got all these idols. You got all this worship going on, but you don't know God. I'm here to tell you about him. I'm here to tell you that God wants you to know him. I want you to know that God is so close to you that it's like you could touch him, but you're missing him. You're groping in the dark. What you need is revelation. The Christian message is not, well, you Hindus have your religious beliefs. We Christians have our religious beliefs, which are helpful to us, just as your beliefs are helpful to you. And granted, we don't really know anything more than you do, but aren't they all lovely beliefs? No, our message is, we are just as ignorant as you are, except God has graciously revealed himself. And we're not smarter or more spiritual than anybody else. We are just the blessed recipients of this revelation, and we're passing it on to you so you can also know the true God. So you can also know the elephant, as it were. And so our message to Hindus is, you're right. There are millions of ways of thinking about God. What if the real God actually spoke? What if he actually revealed himself? What if he actually intervened in history to make himself known? And I think that if we convey that message to Hindus, that's a reasonable message. That a Hindu that, whose heart and mind are being opened by the Spirit of God can hear. That makes sense. We're not denying that it's natural for people to have different views about God. Of course, that's what you'd expect, given our present condition. We're all blind. But God has revealed himself through somebody that knows, and that's Jesus. Now, Paul goes on and he says in verse 28, "For in him we live and move and have our being. As even some of your own poets have said, for we also are his offspring." So Paul here quotes a Stoic poet. This is Aratus that he's quoting, a Greek Stoic poet. In the original context of the poem, this is being spoken about Zeus. So Paul is here again doing something that from an evangelical Christian perspective might seem to be kind of risky. He's quoting a pagan poet, and that's about a pagan deity, and he's applying the words of that pagan poem to the true God. Because Zeus is about as close as you're going to get in ancient Greek polytheistic religion to God. That's the closest analog or analogy you're going to get, because Zeus is the supreme god of the pantheon. And so Paul uses a poem about Zeus and adapts it in order to make a point, which is, we shouldn't think of ourselves as drops in the pond of the divine pool, and as the Stoics did in sort of pantheistic fashion. But we should think of ourselves more as children of God. Now, of course, Paul doesn't mean that literally. We're not literally children of God. But he's saying that's more the analogy that we should use. We should think of ourselves more like his offspring. And we have a special relationship with God. We were created to have that special relationship. The biblical way of putting this is that we were made in God's image. But Paul doesn't use the biblical way of speaking here because he wants to connect with his listeners. He wants to make clear to them in their idiom and their language. And so when we're talking with Hindus, we're going to probably need to do the same thing, especially if they're not very familiar with Christianity. We're going to need to convey to them the Christian message using terms that they will understand. And then we'll have to explain that we don't mean the same thing exactly that they might mean by these words, because we have a different context in which this idea is placed. But we can make those kinds of connections. And so we could say, your concept of karma, we don't quite do it the same way, but we do have a concept of consequences for behavior. We call it sin. You call it karma. It's not exactly the same thing, but it's a place to begin to explain what it is that we mean by sin. And so that kind of translation or contextualization is what missiologists like to call it, people who study missions work. That kind of contextualization is something that we can do and need to do, regardless of which culture that is that we're trying to penetrate with the gospel. The goal is not to accommodate the gospel by changing it to fit the Hindu mindset, but it is to explain it in terms that Hindus can understand. Now then, Paul says in verse 29, and we're getting close to the end here, being then the offspring of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and thought of man. Idolatry, Paul argues here, shows that we are really ignorant of God. The fact that you have all of these idols shows that you really do need to know the God that is the unknown God. There is an unknown God. Because if you really knew God, and you really understood what it meant to be in relationship to this God, you would not make idols, because you yourself are supposed to be the image bearer of God. God made you to be the physical representation of God in the world. That's what being the offspring of God means. You were created as physical creatures to bear His image, to be His icon, His image, His idol, if you will. Not that we worship man, but that we are the physical representations of God in the world. We were created to be His representatives, to be His agents, to be creatures that reflected His nature and His character. We've lost all that. And because we've lost all that, we start worshiping statues that we make with our own hands, out of stone or gold or bronze. It's silly, Paul is saying. And the fact that we would do something silly like that is a dead giveaway that we've lost connection with the God who made us. And so Paul is coming down here pretty strongly at this point on the Greeks. Even the Stoics would give these speeches where they would say, well, of course, idols do not represent real gods. And, of course, worshiping statues is not exactly the highest form of spiritual practice, but it is something that has a great tradition to it in our culture, and it helps many people to sort of connect with the spiritual and the cosmic. And so Stoics, generally speaking, tolerated idolatry. There were a couple of exceptions, but generally speaking, they accommodated themselves to idolatry. Paul is not into accommodation. He is confronting the idolatry here, and he's saying, this is wrong. And he's saying it in such a way as not to tear down the Athenians, but to give them a higher vision of themselves. They had thought of themselves as just servile worshippers of the gods. And Paul says, actually, God made you to be His image bearers in the world. That's an elevated, a noble view of human beings. So he's not saying it in such a way as to tear them down, but to offer them a new perspective on themselves that is one that brings nobility and respect to humanity. And we need to do that with Hindus. We need to help Hindus see that we're not trying to tear them down, but we're trying to share with them an uplifting, ennobling message that God made them to be His image bearers. And yes, they've lost that, but Christ came so that they could have it back. And God has acted to restore that image in us, to restore us to a right relationship with Himself, and to help us get past the superstition of idol worship, even as a mythological construct, but to understand what true religion is all about, which is a relationship with the living creator of the universe. Now then, Paul concludes his speech in verses 30 and 31. He says, "Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to men that all everywhere should repent, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead." Now here Paul talks about judgment. There's coming a day of judgment, a day of bringing the world to its knees. Now, this is expressed in a very mild way. There's no fire and brimstone, at least in this record of the speech. But the Stoics certainly would have understood that this judgment meant a destruction of the world as we know it, a tearing down of all that which was not consistent with the divine order. And Paul is saying there is coming a destructive judgment on the ignorance and the idolatry and the corruption of human nature. And God is going to bring this judgment upon the world. And so now at this point, the third primary deity in Hindu religion comes into the picture, which is Shiva the destroyer. And Paul is saying God is the creator, God is the sustainer, the providential sustainer of life, but God is also the judge. This is not exactly what Hindus mean by the destroyer deity of Shiva, but it is analogous to it. And so Paul, if he were speaking to Hindus, he would say, what you superstitiously, ignorantly worship in these three different deities, I am telling you there is one God who created the world, who sustains the world, who will judge the world in righteousness, and that one God wants you to know him and have a relationship with him as his children. So that's what Paul's doing here, is he is articulating a message in which all the different ways that people think about God really come together in a coherent, biblically sound understanding. But he does it in such a way that it connects with people in their pagan mindset. This is why this message is such a powerful model for sharing the gospel with Hindus. Hindus are also basically pagans. That is, they are outside of the monotheistic Judeo-Christian worldview religious context. It's calling them pagans is not to tear them down. It's simply to acknowledge that they are in that context of being outside of that context of God's self-revelation of himself to the people of Israel and through Jesus and through the apostles in the New Testament. They don't know the true God. And so Paul goes to Athens where they also don't know him. And he proclaims this true God to them in this very effective fashion that really connects with them in ways that they at least can begin to understand. And it takes time. Not everybody gets it at once. If you read the reaction of the Athenians, some of them believed, some of them scoffed, and some of them said, well, we'll have to think about this and maybe talk about it another time. And that's usually what you get anywhere you go. But what Paul is doing then is he is bringing together the Christian message in a way that articulates it so that to overcome the misunderstandings in that culture. The Athenians, when they heard Paul talk about Jesus and the resurrection, thought that he was talking about two deities. Because that made sense in their context. There are lots of gods. Paul, you're talking about Jesus and something called anastasis, resurrection, I guess that's the name of another deity. Some scholars think that Paul is actually being accused here of talking about Jesus and a consort deity named resurrection. So Paul, of course, is doing no such thing, so he has to straighten them out. No, when I talk about resurrection, I'm not talking about another deity. I'm talking about an historical event that has taken place in the person of Jesus, the man that God raised from the dead, to signal the beginning of the age to come in which there will be a judgment and a resurrection. And of course, that was out of left field from an Athenian philosophical point of view. People don't rise from the dead. But that is the message that Paul was there to preach. Jesus has done what you think is impossible. He has risen from the dead. This makes Jesus absolutely unique, as the Athenians would be the first to acknowledge. And likewise, when we talk to Hindus, we want them to know about Jesus' resurrection. We want them to understand that Jesus is not one of many incarnations or avatars of Vishnu. He is the unique embodiment, the unique incarnation of God, because in Jesus, God conquered death, overcame death for the world through his death and resurrection. That is unique, and that is life-changing, life-transforming. It's an historical event. It's not mythology. This is not Krishna with his 30,000 girlfriends, right? This is not Krishna the warrior deity. This is an historical person, Jesus of Nazareth, a real guy, a real man, who really was crucified by the Romans, and who really did rise from the dead, proving to the world that that judgment day was coming. And that judgment day, of course, is incompatible with the Hindu concept of reincarnation. If there is going to be a final day of judgment, this whole theory about reincarnation or transmigration of souls, in which you improve yourself spiritually until you achieve oneness with the divine, that's out. You were created as physical beings. You live on this earth. You live, you die. At the end of history, there will be a day of judgment. There will be a resurrection. You need to make sure that you know the true God before that day comes. God has told everyone everywhere that it's time to repent, to come to a true knowledge of God, and he's proven that to the world through the resurrection of the historical man, Jesus of Nazareth, from the dead. That's our message, that Jesus is the key figure who reveals to the world who God really is and what it means to know him. And that's a message that translates very well in the Hindu context. All right, that's my presentation for this evening. Let me open it up for your comments and questions here. We've got about 10 or 15 minutes. We'll take as much time as you like, though. So, I guess we have to stop by 11:30. So, if you guys have any comments or questions, I will relinquish the microphone, and you guys can have a turn here. Hi, Stan. Stan asks about something he was told when he was in India, that a museum curator had told him that Krishna washed feet, and compared that with the story in the Gospels of Jesus washing his disciples' feet. He wants to know, did this event predate Christ's birth? Well, if Krishna was even a real historical person, which is very much in question, Krishna would have lived a long time before Jesus. However, there are a lot of mythological stories about Krishna that the dating of them is very difficult to know in many cases with any kind of certainty. Most of the texts that we have about these stories date from after the coming of Christ, which makes it very difficult to know for sure. I have not heard this particular story about Krishna washing people's feet, so I can't comment on that specifically. But I can tell you that many people have tried to construct an argument that the story of Christ was somehow taken from Krishna. That's just not even historically plausible. The Jews did not have that kind of contact with India. All of the evidence from the Gospels is that the accounts, the narratives about Jesus' events, actions, teachings, etc., flow out of his Jewish first century context there in Galilee and Judea. There's really no reason to think that there's any historical connection to stories about Krishna. Now, of course, all religions are going to have some similarities with one another. There's going to be parallels. So it's not out of the realm of possibility that there might be a story about Krishna washing someone's feet. I don't know, but I can safely tell you that you would not find a cluster of parallels such that you would have to conclude that Krishna was another form of Christ. That would not be the case. The idea that Krishna was crucified and rose from the dead, that's not true. It's just not true. Lots of interesting stories about Krishna. That isn't one of them. Let's see. Someone says, I find it interesting that in these other non-Christian systems, that Christ is recognized as anything and everything but God. Well, that's true. Non-Christian religions that have contact with Christianity almost invariably try to find some way to include Jesus in their religion, but in a way that allows that religion to remain relatively undisturbed. So in Islam, Jesus is one of many prophets. In Hinduism, Jesus is one of many avatars of Vishnu. As we will see in Buddhism, Jesus is an enlightened one for the West. That's a common explanation of Jesus from Buddhists. So yes, this is a common phenomenon, and it's motivated by the fact that it's obvious to people that the figure of Jesus is a very compelling figure. And so people feel the need to do something with Jesus. Anything else? Any other questions? Somebody asks, why, given the animosity between Muslims and Hindus, do we think we can make inroads with them? Well, I mean, people convert from one religion to another all the time when they're in a culture and a political system that allows it. When people have freedom of religion, people change religion relatively easily. They certainly do that in the United States. So the issue is really one of religious freedom. Now, of course, not everybody changes religions, and not everybody is willing to even consider changing their faith that they grew up with. But if we believe that the gospel is not just our philosophy, but is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, as Paul says in Romans 1:16. If we believe that the gospel is a message that God is using us to bring to people, so that by His Spirit they might be convicted of sin, brought to repentance, brought into a relationship with the true God, then, of course, when we share the gospel with people, the Holy Spirit will be at work in them, and we can have confidence that some will come to faith. Now, of course, not everyone will. And sometimes it takes years. Most missionaries who have gone into areas of the world where no one had heard the gospel before find themselves taking several years before they make one convert. That's very common, because it takes time to establish the relationships and the credibility and the understanding, in some cases to overcome the resistance, to overcome even political pressures against converting before people come to faith. So this is very common. But the gospel is powerful. God is at work in people's lives. The most surprising people convert. People you never think would often do. So that's kind of the short answer to that, is there is hope. There are Muslims converting to faith in Jesus Christ. You might think that wouldn't happen, but it does. It happens a lot when people have the freedom and the opportunity to do so. It even happens when they don't, when they're doing so at the cost of their lives, or at least the potential cost of their lives. They still come to Christ because it is the power of God for salvation. Let me see. I think I see another question here. Again, religions that are familiar with Jesus, their people tend to find something about Jesus that is very compelling. They feel that they need to do something with the message of Jesus. This may be because they want to kind of get Christians off their backs, you might say. It may be because they really like Jesus. They feel attracted to Jesus, but they don't want to understand Jesus in the Christian way. And so they will reinterpret Jesus to fit their own belief system. And this is what Gandhi did. And this is what many Hindus have done, is to reinterpret Jesus as one of many individuals who embodied the divine, who revealed the divine to us. And I think that this is a starting point from which we can help Hindus hear the gospel. You can ask them, do you believe that Jesus embodied the divine in some way? That he was a special person who had a special experience of the divine? Yeah, oh yes, absolutely. All right. So, Jesus would be a good person to listen to find out more about the divine, wouldn't he? I mean, wouldn't that make sense, that if Jesus was an avatar of Vishnu, or if Jesus was a person who especially embodied God, that we should listen to what he has to say about it? Oh yes, absolutely, makes sense. Well, then we can recommend that they read the Gospels. And one of the most important things that we can do for a Hindu is to encourage them simply to read the Bible, and in particular to read the Gospels. And just to say, you recognize that Jesus was an important person, that Jesus was somebody who, in a very special way, embodied God. Well, I would really like to encourage you to find out more about Jesus, because I think that anything that helps us to know more about God would be good. Wouldn't you agree? And so here, let me encourage you to read the Gospel of John. And this is a way that we can, in a very non-offensive fashion, encourage Hindus to explore Christianity. And we wouldn't even put it that way. It's not, we're trying to get you to convert to our religion, to our church. But rather, we're excited about Jesus. We think Jesus reveals God in a very special way indeed. We would like to share that with you. Wouldn't you like to read more about Jesus? Hear what Jesus himself had to say in the Gospels. And many Hindus will say yes to that. They say, oh, I would love to read the Bible. They might say, I've tried to read the Gospels. I didn't really understand them. Perhaps you could help me. Again, you might be surprised what people would say. But the key here is that we want to turn Hindus on to Jesus. We want to point them to Jesus, encourage them to find out about him. And in doing that, we will help them overcome the religious barriers and come to a saving knowledge of the real Jesus Christ. Well, I think we'll wrap it up at this point. Thanks everybody for listening and for the good questions. Next week we will begin our final 2-week sequence. We will talk about Buddhism. Buddhism is probably more prevalent and more popular in North America and other westernized countries than Hinduism is. But it's really important to understand something about Hinduism before you try to talk about Buddhism. So that's the order in which we've done things. Next week we will give an overview of Buddhism, and then we will conclude this course by talking about understanding Buddhism from a Christian perspective and how we can talk to Buddhists about the Lord Jesus Christ. I'll go ahead and answer your question, Carrie. I am going to Uganda next month. That's coming up pretty fast now, I guess. And everything looks A-okay for that. As far as I know, everything is on track for that. I'll be leaving the week after we finish up this course, or just a few days after we finish up this course, and be gone about 12 days. 2 of those days at least are just travel days. And so please pray for me. That's going to be a completely new experience for me. I've never been to Africa. I'm sure it'll be very interesting, and I will need to learn something about sharing the gospel in another culture, a very different culture, and so you can pray for me in that regard as well. All right, well, thanks everybody, and we'll see you guys here next week to talk about Buddhism.